Hope you've had a good lunch, good workshop sessions, still full of energy, because as I promised, it will be an interactive session we have next. So our afternoon speaker is Dave Coleman. He's the Managing Director of the Carbon Literacy Project. Please welcome Dave.
Good afternoon and welcome to the closing session. It was my pleasure yesterday to be the hors d'oeuvre before the awards last night, and now I get to be the dessert at the end of the session as well. This is a presentation about the Carbon Literacy Project, and I know a few people have come across this already, and you will have seen the name bandied around, and a number of you will have already done the training. And I was in two minds whether to just kind of brain dump a whole thing about this is what the Carbon Literacy Project is, and it would be a bit like a lecture, or to make it into an interactive workshop. And I couldn't decide, so I'm going to try and do a little bit of both at the same time and cram it all into 30 minutes without the aid of a safety net. So we'll see how we get on. Just out of interest, how many people are already carbon literate? How many people in the audience? Ooh, wow, that's very good. That's about 50% of you. So partly this is going to be a little bit about what carbon literacy actually is, because you'll have done the Carbon Literacy for Communities course through KSB. But there's all sorts of messages and content that's smuggled into that cleverly by KSB. So a little bit of this is what is carbon literacy and what the content is. But I also wanted to talk about the wider community of people who are carbon literate that you as carbon literate people in Scotland are now part of. So first of all, a bit of history about the actual project. I'll just tilt that down a little bit so I can see it. Cool. So it started in Manchester in 2011. We launched. It was a response to Manchester City's climate change action plan, which said that we wanted to give everybody a day's worth of learning about climate change in Manchester. That plan was a plan that anyone in the city could deliver. When we delivered that plan and put it together, the city was doing very well, the economy was booming. As soon as we wrote this pledge that we wanted everybody to have a day's worth of learning about climate change, the economy completely tanked, the government changed and was much less supportive, the Copenhagen climate negotiations were a disaster, and this hugely ambitious thing was left hanging out there. They were looking at it thinking, oh, I'm going absolutely nowhere near that. So after about a year, Cooler Projects, which is the community interest company I run with my co-director Phil Corbell, picked this up and we ran with this. And we pulled together a working group of 30 different people and organisations to try and say, how could we do a great day's learning about climate change? Because we had absolutely no monopoly on the best ideas. So we put together this Brains Trust who came up with the concept that became carbon literacy. We pulled together that working group. We then piloted this approach and we were astonished. It worked very well right from the very beginning. We launched it publicly in 2011. It then rapidly expanded across Greater Manchester and then across the UK and then on into Europe. We'll touch on that a little bit later on. And after a couple of years, we established an independent charity, and it's the charity that now owns the project, and we handed the project over. So that's about 5 years history in about 60 seconds. But what is carbon literacy? Because actually we've used that term quite a bit over the last 48 hours, and I've thrown it around a bit. What do we actually mean by carbon literacy? And this is the definition that working group came up with. An awareness of the carbon costs and impacts of everyday activities. But we thought awareness wasn't enough. There's no point in just being aware. You've got to do something with that awareness. So you needed a motivation to actually act on that new awareness. And not just the motivation, but the ability within your sphere of influence to act. So that had to be in there as well. And this was all with the aim of reducing emissions individually, but also as part of the communities that we belonged to and the organisations that we were linked to. So that's why the definition is what it is. And I can see one or two people scribbling, probably trying to take that down very rapidly. Don't worry, if you come to the store with the balloons, we've got little cards you can take away that actually have that definition on it. So what actually does that mean? Carbon literacy is a day's worth of learning about climate change. It doesn't have to be a single day. It could be 2 half days, could be 5 2-hour sessions at night, it could be some e-learning, it could be some book reading, it could be watching An Inconvenient Truth and doing a workshop. So that day's worth can be made up in lots of different ways. We don't deliver any training. We oversee the standard and we provide resources and we support organisations like KSB that do. The group said the learning had to be social learning. It's no use talking to people about polar bears because most people don't meet a polar bear. It doesn't affect us in our daily lives. So the training had to be about what people did right now, whoever they were, whatever walk of life, and it had to be delivered in the context in which they lived. So if it was in work, it was about the workplace. If it was in the community, it was about where they lived. If it was in education, it had to be relevant to their qualifications. Wherever possible, we wanted the delivery to be peer-to-peer because we trust people like us as the most trusted source of information. So there's no use trying to put just experts in front of people. I'd be far more convinced by someone who looks and feels like me. So we wanted the training delivered by peers wherever that was possible. And we would then certify what the person did as part of their day, and they would get a certificate to say they were now carbon literate if they passed some criteria which were in place. We check and have a look at the training materials. So Keep Scotland Beautiful design their course. We then verify that that course we felt would deliver carbon literacy. And we then see a portfolio of evidence for every learner. So when you did your courses, we physically sat down and read the things that you did on your course and looked at the things that you wrote down in order to certify you, if you're already certified. Successful learners get a certificate to say they're carbon literate, and increasingly that has value to employers and for people to enhance their work skills. Organisations can certify themselves now as being carbon literate organisations, and we provide a big support structure to support people designing the training, rolling it out, and we bring together people to work collaboratively. This was never designed to compete with all the great climate change training and environmental projects that were out there. This was about taking all the great stuff and trying to make the sum of the parts greater than the whole. I just got that right? I think that's the right way around. You know what I mean? And very much, it had to be about the power of positive action, the fact that we can and do make a difference as individuals, and a much bigger difference when we act collectively. And there's now a whole certification scheme for individuals, for trainers and facilitators and consultants, because there's now a whole ecosystem of people that help deliver carbon literacy in all sorts of different contexts. There's a certification scheme for organisations, carbon literate organisations, and Keep Scotland Beautiful is just accredited as a carbon literate organisation. And we're just about to launch a carbon literacy training organisation, which is where we are approaching selected organisations that are very good at delivering this to communities and other audiences and inviting them to certify as a training organisation. And you won't be surprised to hear that we've already invited Keep Scotland Beautiful to do exactly that. Amazingly, this approach of having a standard that describes a day's training with content that's consistent everywhere, but also adapted to each different audience, is unique. And we've had that verified repeatedly by researchers, by university researchers, and even by the United Nations, who rang us up one afternoon and said, hello, we're the United Nations Environment Programme. This approach you're using is unique. We know of no project worldwide that does this, that takes a piece of learning that's consistent and just adapted to every audience and works with all the different sectors at the same time. So 2 years ago, COP21, we went to Paris and were awarded Transformative Action Programme status, one of 100 projects identified that, if rolled out at scale, could make a material difference to the way that we deal with climate change. Their words, not mine. So we talk a lot about our three audiences, and this is one of the things that makes the carbon literacy approach unique, that it's one piece of training, but it works with people who live, citizens and communities, people who work, so it works with workplace and employment, and people who study, so it works in schools and universities. And one piece across three audiences is unique. So I thought I'd give you some examples of some of the audiences that have already rolled out carbon literacy. So those logos won't be familiar to you. They're the logos of 20 different housing associations that all work across Greater Manchester. So this is the metropolitan area around Greater Manchester, population about 2.5 million. So when we work with people who live, we work directly with citizens and community groups, but we work with large organisations that address citizens. So we approached a lot of housing providers, and they self-organised into a group of 20 that became known as Carbon Literacy 4 Registered Providers. And then somebody smart decided to take the word 4 and convert it into the numeral 4 because it looked like an A, and now it's known universally as CLARPS, if you say it in a Manchester accent. And the CLARPS consortium is something that actually has quite a lot of momentum around Greater Manchester. But what these housing providers did was adopted carbon literacy and said, if we all put a little bit of money in each, we can develop our own materials, and then we all collaborate. So rather than compete with each other, we share our training materials, we share our trainers, we share our approaches, and everybody gets to benefit. So they produce their own training materials, 5 different carbon literacy training courses for different audiences. They drew down some European funding to support them. They trained 50 trainers within those housing associations through a train-the-trainer process. Those trainers then started to train staff inside the 20 housing associations, who then started to cascade it out to their residents and their tenants. And the reason they do it is because it helps them as housing providers of social housing deliver their social housing and improved quality of life to their tenants better. And that's why they do it. Just a comment on the funding thing. I was slightly amused by the pitch this morning from the panel about second and third year funding. And I've done community campaigning for some while. I totally get that. 1 year, you can't plan for the future, it's really difficult, so your challenges, you really need consistency of funding. But the reason it amused me was that this is not a problem we have in Manchester at all. On account of the fact we don't have the first year's funding. We have no funding at all. It's always inspiring for me to come to Scotland and see what's been done with the Climate Challenge Fund, because there is no equivalent in England. So when this is rolled out in England, it's done without any central funding at all. So I wouldn't say this in front of Rosanna, but you should kind of think yourself lucky, because you can do so much with the Climate Challenge Fund you've got, and it's one of the reasons why Scotland has advanced so quickly with carbon literacy and other projects, but is a refreshing change for me coming up from the other side of the wall to see how much is possible with a small amount of money and how catalytic it can be. So one of the things I'd love is if Rosanna actually talked to some of the ministers in the Westminster Parliament. People who work, big employers. I thought I'd choose one or two employers, and there are large companies and small companies, but I thought I'd choose something slightly unusual to show you as an employer. So I said there'd be a bit of audience interaction. Does anybody recognise anybody in the photograph on your right? Now, however odd it seems, if you think you recognise somebody, shout it out. Does anybody look familiar? Yeah. So any more specific than that? Whoever shouted that out, got it right? Yeah, that's Sally Webster. Who watches Coronation Street? Anybody watch Coronation Street? Oh, a few hands at the back. I don't know why the Corrie fans are all hiding at the back, or else the people at the front are a bit shy. So the diminutive woman in the middle is Sally Webster, and her on-screen husband, Tim Metcalfe, is the guy in the cap to the left. Because that's the Coronation Street, a couple of the actors and the Coronation Street production team, because the Coronation Street team is carbon literate. Because ITV is based in Manchester, and they wanted to do something to reduce their environmental footprint, and they adopted carbon literacy. So that was taken on the set of Coronation Street last year when we were presenting them with their Carbon Literate Organisation Award. And our challenge to them as an action was, well, okay, you're carbon literate now, so your community action is, well, your community is the audience for Coronation Street. So how can you get carbon literacy into Coronation Street? There you go, that's your challenge. So in January this year, and I've still got the slightly illegally downloaded clip from the programme, there was a 2-minute debate led by Sally Webster in a front room about climate change and the fact that 97% of scientists, Tim, agree that it's really happening, we've got to do something about it. And it was all done in a very humorous Coronation Street kind of fashion, and when Tim wouldn't take it seriously, she imposed a sex ban unless you'd have a proper conversation about climate change with her, and if you know the character, that's entirely in character. But it meant it put climate change into the front rooms of the 10 to 20 million people who watch Coronation Street every week and on a regular basis. And actually, if you watch closely, there are regularly climate change messages in Coronation Street to do with recycling, getting your bins out on the right day, what you put in the bin, what you don't put in the bin, where you buy stuff, and they're subtly putting those messages in because that's part of their carbon literacy action. This photograph's of the BBC, Media City. BBC have worked very extensively on carbon literacy and have rolled it out in Salford Media City, but actually across the UK. And have done some training in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, and have formed a consortium with BBC, ITV, BAFTA, and a number of other organisations with their audience, which is media organisations and production. So this was the BBC being ambassadorial. All those people in the room are business leaders and leaders of organisations around Greater Manchester that the BBC is saying, look, we've done carbon literacy and this is how we benefited, and we think you as leaders should introduce it to your organisations. A couple of soaps. I don't know if anybody does watch Coronation Street or EastEnders, but if you look closely, can you see there's, particularly on the Coronation Street one, there's a little logo that says Albert Plus Sustainable Production, that little carbon footprint thing there. So Albert is a standard for sustainable production in TV and media that was first invented by the BBC, but then they shared it throughout the entire sector. It's delivered the training required by BAFTA, but it's quite technical about carbon footprinting. And they were looking for a way of engaging with people so that they realised the context for why the carbon footprint of a TV production or a dramatic production was important. So they adopted carbon literacy. So now when you watch TV and you watch programmes at end, have a look for that Albert footprint at the end. You'll be amazed how many programmes you see it on. Whenever you see that, you know that the people engaged have almost certainly done their carbon literacy training as part of their Albert training, because the two now work hand in hand. And BAFTA are now starting to roll carbon literacy out across Europe as part of their ambassadorial role. People who study, our third audience. So we work with universities, we work with schools. We had a thing called Carbon Active, which we ran, and again, this is about engaging with people. So it was a 3-day festival of carbon literacy, and we ran it in the big atrium in the middle of the largest shopping centre in Manchester, which, if you know Manchester, is a thing called Manchester Arndale. So it's a huge, it's in the centre of the city, but it's like a big out-of-town shopping centre. Average footfall on a typical busy day is about 100,000 people go through the shopping centre, so it's huge. So we took over the entire central square, with the approval, obviously, of the shopping centre, and we set up a thing called the low-carbon classroom for school children. We set up a mock classroom with bench tables and some blackboards and props and things, and we had 3 schools came in each day, and they'd all come in and sit down and have a little drink in the morning, and at 10 o'clock we'd ring a bell. And then all the school children, who were mainly 8, 9 and 10-year-olds, they stood up, they walked out, and there were various baffled shoppers wandering around the outside of this because it was in a big open space. And the children walked up to the shoppers and said, looked up at the grown-ups and said, "How much do you know about climate change?" So most of the shoppers would say, "No, I don't know." So the small child would say, "Right, well, come on into the classroom and we'll tell you all about it." So they would bring the adults in. The adults sat down in the classroom at the bench tables, and the 8, 9 and 10-year-olds then did a 10-minute presentation to them about climate change and how they, as adults who were responsible for their carbon footprint, needed to change things. And did they know? Did they know about that? Did they know that it was having these effects? And what about extreme weather? So what were they going to do about it? And over the course of 3 days, we had about 1,900 conversations from children from, I think it was 11 schools we had in total over the 3 days. And we very much like to invert that paradigm. Lots of people say, "Oh, you've got to teach the children. It's the children of tomorrow. They need to know." No, actually, the kids are really good. They get it. They get it in school, and they actually get it as a message. It's the people of my age that are the problem. And we just thought it was a great idea to take the children to teach the adults, not the other way around. But again, it was a piece of engagement. So that was what the low-carbon classroom was about. Whoops, and I just clicked the wrong way. So that's some of the school children. And you always get polar bears in climate change messages, but we always like to invert the paradigm. So we had a large polar bear with a T-shirt that said, "Save the human," because it wasn't about saving the polar bears, it was about saving ourselves, and that was really the message that we wanted to convey. What have we achieved so far? Carbon literacy graduates. So Keep Scotland Beautiful has now trained over 200 people, are now certified as carbon literate as a result of the Carbon Literacy for Communities course, which is fantastic. To put that into context, those 200 are now part of 6,700-ish, already slightly more than that, carbon literacy graduates across the UK and Europe. So those are the number of people that are already certified as carbon literate, and there are many more now under training. We have 21 carbon literate organisations, ranging from the very small to the very large, such as the BBC and ITV and Keep Scotland Beautiful. And we're just about to launch carbon literate training organisations. We're expecting to have 4 or 5 of those. So that's the scale of the project at the moment, but we're now accelerating in terms of growth and scale of growth quite quickly. Last night, if anybody was here, I know some of you were here last night, I talked a bit about throwing a pebble in a pond and the fact that you create a bit of a splash, but there are ripples and you never know how far those ripples go. So this project is about creating 6,700 stones in ponds and hoping those ripples go a long way and add up to a lot. So there are 4 key areas within the carbon literacy standard, I said we'd talk a little bit more about the content. So the standard defines the knowledge so that everybody that does carbon literacy anywhere gets the same core knowledge about climate change, what it is, how we know it's happening, how confident are we, what effects it's having, what people are doing about it, what we can do as individuals, and then what are we going to do, the person that's actually doing the learning. But there are some other things which are part of the content of the carbon literacy standard and have to be there in every piece of training. And they're not always obvious when you receive the training. So I thought it would be worthwhile just covering them to explain what they are, and also reflecting on them in the context of the projects which you deliver. So the first is learning method, the second is learning method, the third is values, and the fourth is action. And all of these are compulsory parts of carbon literacy, which need to be adapted by each piece of training so it suits the particular audience it's being addressed to. So in terms of knowledge, I've summarised it a little bit, but this is what's included. So it's about the fact that we know climate change is happening and the evidence. And the important evidence that other people are taking action, the social proof of people are taking action, lots more is happening. One of the things we found when we set the project up was that Phil and I had already done a bit of green campaigning in Manchester and had been involved for a while. So, we knew quite a lot of organisations. We were quite well connected. So when we set it up, we thought, well, we're going to know quite a lot about what's going on already, and we'll survey it to find out and learn the best lessons. And when we actually went out and looked, there was probably 10 times more stuff going on than we had any idea. And we thought we were quite well connected and knew it. There was far more going on than we realised. And the second thing we learned was that no one else realised that either. Everybody thought there were isolated little schemes going on. But in fact, many, many people and organisations were all acting on climate change, thinking that they were relatively isolated and only knew one or two other organisations. So there will be even more going on now, and even more going on than you realise. And the scale of action on climate change is far greater than many of us realise. And that social proof is important, because when we know that other people are doing stuff, as individuals it motivates us to do more and be part of that, because it's normal. Why wouldn't we? The second area is learning method. So we define the ways that people learn, because the experts that advised us when we had that original working group of 30 said some of these things we needed as specific bits of content to maximise the chance that this day's learning would be effective and would effectively communicate climate change. And values. Sorry, this slide's a little bit wordy, so I'll leave it up there, but it was harder to summarise this one. The values that training conveys are really important in terms of whether people actually pick it up, run with it, do things with it, and are affected by it, and are changed by it. And the last one is action. Don't worry that I've hopped past that slide. I'm going to come back to it in a second. There was no point in carbon literacy being a really fantastic, purely academic, esoteric bit of training that you thought, oh, that's very interesting, and then left the room and didn't do anything as a consequence. So if you're going to be carbon literate, you have to take an action. You have to take an action as an individual within the sphere of influence that you have, and you have to take an action as part of a larger group of people, because by doing that, you start engaging with other people, and the message of your carbon literacy and the fact that you're dealing with climate change starts to get extended to that group. So rather than me just standing here talking at you for 30 minutes and then disappearing, I thought it might be a little bit useful if you talked to each other for a little bit. So I'm going to go back to that slide about learning method. So we mandate that carbon literacy must be 1 day's worth of learning. But the experts who advised us and our experience seems to show that this kind of learning is most effective when it's local learning. And by local we mean could be geographically local, but it could be local in terms of the sector you work or the job that you do, so that it's the people around you that are like you. That's your locality. We found it was most effective when it was delivered by peers, because as I said earlier, peer-to-peer learning our peers are the most trusted source of information. We found that where people learn by group inquiry, so rather than us giving them answers and trying to spoon feed them and make it too easy, we let them investigate and find their own answers was most effective. And it had to be positively framed. It's easy to scare the pants off people about climate change, but it's a real cliche now. But if Martin Luther King had said, I have a nightmare, probably not many people would have followed him. So negative messages can be motivational, but they can also be scary, and you don't take action because it's so uncomfortable. You just go la 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 and do nothing at all. So we wanted our messages to not shy away from the fact there's dangerous, nasty stuff happening out there, and we should be scared of it, but that we need to view it positively and take the opportunity to make a positive difference. So the training had to be positive. So sometimes when we deliver training or we deliver anything, there are things that sometimes we kind of know, but it's not so much about what we know, it's what we remember to do at the time. So what I'd like you to do is to chat to the people around you for a couple of minutes and think about the projects that you have run, are currently running, are maybe planning and thinking of applying for funding for, in the context of this learning method. I have a look at these bullet points and think, how many of these boxes does your project currently, and will your project, if you're planning, actually tick? So many of you, I know this is the cream of community projects across Scotland, many of you will already know and be applying these things. So if that's the case, I'd like you to tell the people around you how you're applying them. But equally, if you're not, maybe ask the person next to you how they have applied them or how they might apply them. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes or so to have a chat with the person with you. Sorry, it's only 2 minutes. And then we'll come back and just get some feedback on as to what you think and what you're doing. So you've got 2 minutes. Go. Rightio. So 1 day's worth of learning. That's a consistent thing that's part of carbon literacy. So local learning. Who would like to give us an example of local learning or a challenge about local learning? Can we have a quick show? Who wants to be first to talk about local learning? There must be somebody here, because you're all community groups who do local learning. Come on. Who have we got? Does no one want to say anything about local learning? Okay, so how about delivery by peers? Does anyone want to say something about delivery by peers? Has anyone got a particularly good example? Fantastic. Has anybody else got another example? Yeah, yep, that lady on your right there. Is there another example somewhere? We'll send a mic to you. Gentleman in black down here for the other roving microseconds. Can you see that one? There's a chap in black. Just put your hand up so the other mic can find you. Is it wave?
Julian, is he talking about you?
Oh, sorry, we've got two people, both wearing black, dead in line. So we'll give it to the chap first, then we'll come back to you. Okay, go.
Okay, well, I can probably link it in with local learning as well, because we are a learning centre. But certainly we have found...
Just remind us who you are so that people can...
Oh, sorry, Jane Dixon from Legg Learning Centre.
Thank you.
Because a lot of our tutors are actually community members that just have special skills, you tend to find that the classes respond a lot more to being taught by people who they know, or that they don't see them as some big lofty trainer that's being brought in from far away.
Yeah.
And that's extremely sort of helpful, I think, to make people relate to it. And it's very, very, very effective.
That's exactly what we found as well. So that's good. And a gentleman at the back, a long way away.
Hello?
Hi.
Julian from Greenwich Academy. As part of our CCF project, we're training up some climate champions. Now, the first round are volunteers that would work for our project, but the second approach is to find other groups and train some of their members to become champions within that group, to kind of do that pebble thing, spread it.
Absolutely, that kind of cascade. We're doing a thing with Manchester Metropolitan University at the moment where they've trained a group of 6 students as trainers, and those students are now training other groups of students as trainers, and the whole idea is that it's cascading out. So they're in their second year of that. It's still early, but the cascade is getting bigger. And we had the gentleman in black down here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yep, absolutely.
So I work at the James Hutton Institute, half-time as a researcher and half-time as the Institute's sustainability coordinator. And that kind of dual role, I think, gives me far more credibility than someone who would be doing that full-time, because I can also talk to the researchers within the organisation and understand their concerns. No, I can't turn my ultra-low temperature freezer up to -70. I have samples in there that I don't know if they would still, that kind of thing, so I can understand.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the next bullet point was group inquiries. Anybody got anything you wanted to say about group inquiry? In that case, we'll move. Oh, yep.
It's not really necessarily a climate challenge fund thing, but I do quite a lot of teaching and training at universities, and I think a lot of the time, the more that the group is doing themselves, the more that people are actually involved in the learning and learning from each other, the more effective it is. So, this kind of idea that, for every 5 minutes that I'm presenting something, there should be 10 minutes of them assimilating, talking, learning from each other, makes it a lot more effective. And I think the same thing is probably true of this as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot of knowledge always in the room. Always.
Absolutely. There's always, none of us can know everything about this field, isn't it? Even when we're specialists in the field, there's always more knowledge in the room. And one of the things that we've found is a lot of people who are communicating climate change are worried about climate change deniers. And there's always this worry that, oh my God, what if someone really takes me on and it all gets a bit, loads of argy-bargy. So if you're ever in a situation, first of all, it happens much more rarely than you imagine. It happens very, very occasionally. But if you do, if you're leading the training, don't answer. Ask the other people in the room what they think. What always tends to happen is everybody else turns around to the denier and says, don't be ridiculous, there's this, there's that. What? You can't possibly believe that. And actually, the peers of the denier tend to deal with it, not you as the trainer. So I'll hand you that as a piece of guidance, one trainer to another. We did some stuff at a housing association, and they were doing it with their operatives, so the people who go out and maintain the buildings, paint them, plaster them, hit things with hammers, and they all turned up in their overalls covered in paint and plaster. And one of the guys started to come out with a kind of, well, I'm not sure it's really happening. And all his mates turned on him and basically said, don't be ridiculous, what about that? What about that? And they go, oh, okay. And they had far more credibility with him than I ever would have. So, last bullet point, positivity. Has anyone got anything you want to say about positivity in training?
Really important.
Yay! I think we should probably end on that note. That was really good. So, we have to recognise the fact that some people are very scared by climate change and they won't want to talk about it because it is uncomfortable. And some people's values, particularly if they have a career in fossil fuels, are going to be very threatened by this kind of learning, and we're threatening their fundamental values. And if they bought a lot of stuff with the money that they've earned, they're going to find it very threatening. So we have to frame our training in terms of positive ways about how theirs and the lives of other people, their lives and the lives of other people, will be improved. And it needs to be about the power of what we can do, not about what we can't do. And it needs to be about the fact that we will all have better lives if we all collectively take action on this. Aware of my 30 minutes time, which I've just gone over, I won't go through the values and I won't go through the action bit. But if you want to know more about this, you don't need to memorize the slides. You can download the carbon literacy standard from our website, which is carbonliteracy.com. If you want to know more about carbon literacy training, you should clearly be talking to Keep Scotland Beautiful, because they've already trained over 200 people, and there are plans for more training courses formally, and training for communities that are interested in bringing training to them. So talk directly to Keep Scotland Beautiful. But equally, if what you're thinking of doing isn't in a community context, by all means contact us at the project directly. We're very keen on collaborating. So we're keen to work with housing providers in Scotland, because the CLARPS network wants to share its materials with other housing providers. BBC and BAFTA want to work with more media organisations, both across Scotland, across the UK and into Europe. And there are many networks and consortia that I've not mentioned that are keen on sharing resources. Why, as Rosanna said this morning, why try and invent new answers to questions that we've already got really good answers to? So let's share and collaborate the resources, the ideas and the skills that we've already got. And as carbon literate people in Scotland, you're now part not just of the Keep Scotland Beautiful CCF community, but the wider carbon literacy community worldwide. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you've gained some interest and some feedback out of that session. And thank you very much for listening to me.